This video is brought to you by Captivating History. America during the 1800s was changing rapidly. Since declaring its independence, America was still trying to determine its own identity. From 1800 to 1860, the number of American states had doubled. Millions of immigrants had arrived in the country to try and carve a life for themselves. Two distinct cultural and economic societies had formed, the North and the South, and life in these two areas were radically different. Those living in North America had already taken steps toward industrialization. The northern climate was better for smaller farmsteads, and by the 1860s, the percentage of agricultural workers dropped from 70% to 40% of the populace. The number of people living in urban areas rose, with many moving from farming communities into the cities. The population was much larger than that of the South, and they had begun to produce goods and establish trade networks with the help of factories, railroads, and trade ports. 4 million immigrants arrived in the North between 1840 and 1860 alone. Many of them worked in factories and were an essential workforce in the North. Since the end of the 1700s, northern states had started to abolish slavery, although even in these free states, there were still people kept as slaves. This trend started to worry the people of the slave states, particularly in the South. The southern United States was predominantly agricultural, ranging from large plantations to small farms. The warmer climate was ideal for the production of crops like tobacco and cotton. The owners of the plantations relied on the exploitation of black people to maintain their lifestyles and continue to turn the profits to which they were accustomed. The plantations were so profitable that they did not need industrialization, primarily due to the enslaved people working the fields. The slave states wanted to keep the abolition movement in check, so they determined that there needed to be a balance of free and slave states. Between 1812 and 1850, states were only admitted in pairs, with one being free and the other a slave state. But by 1858, the number of free states outnumbered the slave states by 17 to 15. By the time the war broke out in 1861, America was a country divided in many ways. Abraham Lincoln's election caused the southern states to break away from the North and form the Confederate States of America. When describing life in America during the Civil War, many factors affected the American people's day-to-day existence. Primarily, the color of your skin would determine your lifestyle. Even in the free states, if you were black, you would not be afforded the same freedoms as white people. A prevailing thought at the time was that once the black slaves were freed, they would either be returned to Africa or given somewhere else to colonize. Abraham Lincoln even allocated $600,000 to help to relocate the free black population to Haiti or Liberia. This was obviously unworkable, and black people formed separate communities due to being socially blocked from many established areas, despite their hard-won freedom. Understandably, many black men joined the Union Army, including 7,122 officers and 178,975 soldiers. Although this was not the case when the war first broke out. When looking back at this time, the prevailing thought is that Unionists were anti-slavery, but were even more concerned with keeping the Union together. Worried about alienating some states, Abraham Lincoln decreed that black men would not be allowed to fight in the Union Army at the start of the war. 2 years into the war, the North was desperate for men and decided to allow black recruits. However, they kept black and white troops separate, and black regiments were led by white officers. In the South, dark skin color didn't necessarily mean a life of servitude. In fact, before the Civil War, the number of free black people living in the North was slightly less than in the South, although there was a divide between the upper and lower areas. In the upper South, free black people tended to be dark-skinned and more rural than their lower southern counterparts. This population of free black people had grown in many ways, one being manumission, slave owners freeing their slaves. After the Revolutionary War, many slave owners in the upper South had embraced manumission, and the freed slaves had stayed in the area and started families of their own. The lower South still relied on the slave workforce for cotton production, and free black people would often have lighter skin, showing the slave owner's predisposition to free his offspring. The Louisiana Purchase also brought a large amount of free black people under the authority of the southern states. Nevertheless, the number of free blacks in the South does not mean that their life was easy, and they were subjected to more discriminatory laws than those in the North. Geographical location should also be considered when describing life during the Civil War, and there was a clear divide between life in the North and South at the time. First, both armies mainly fought in the South. While the South was fighting to retain their rights to own people, the North primarily wanted to keep the Union intact. The Union forces had to invade and conquer the South to win the war, while the South wanted to separate themselves from the North and live by their own laws. Due to this invasion, life for many Southerners became extremely hard. The South was not as industrially developed as the North and relied on imports for many manufactured goods. The Unionists blocked the trade ports to the South, which directly impacted both soldiers and civilians alike. Life in the South during this time was very uncertain for ordinary people. With goods in short supply and armies marching through the land, many Southerners experienced severe hardships. While the wealthy plantation owners were at war to keep their free workforce, families living on small homesteads feared losing their livelihood in the conflict. The Unionists conducted the infamous burning raid in Virginia during November and December of 1864, and many poor farmers lost everything. Unionists burnt grain and slaughtered farm animals in the thousands, leaving the people with nothing. Charles Humphreys of the Reserve Brigade reported hearing the shrieks and cries of women and children and witnessing men unsuccessfully pleading with the soldiers for them to spare at least one cow. If you lived in the North, your home was probably a safe distance from the fighting, even if you weren't. While the South was primarily populated with agricultural workers, it was more likely that you would live in an urban area and have a profession or work in a factory in the northern states. If you were an engineer in the 1800s, you were 6 times more likely to come from the North than the South. Just under half of the population led a rural lifestyle, but railroads and education connected people on many levels. Children in the North spent more time in school than those in the South, and a more significant percentage of white Northerners were literate. Reading was becoming a popular pastime, especially amongst women. Due to an excellent rail network, people in rural regions could access books and other goods just as easily as those in urban areas. Sex was another discriminating factor during life in this period, and women would not be granted the vote for another 60 years. During the Civil War, daily life for women changed dramatically. With so many men at war, women had to fill the job gaps, working in factories and tending the farms and businesses of their enlisted husbands. Some traveled with the armies as nurses, caring for the wounded soldiers and helping them to recover. Another war career that was open to women was that of a spy. The top spies for both the Unionists and the Confederates were female. They were often women who lived or worked on one side while secretly supporting the other. Some women were determined to fight alongside the men to support the war effort and would enlist by disguising themselves as men, cutting their hair short and wearing bulky clothing. The Civil War affected women's lives so much that Clara Barton, a hospital nurse, stated that the war advanced women's positions by 50 years. Children during the Civil War were also affected, and the nationwide war altered their lives. Many children had to grow up quickly, helping their mothers with the work at home and elsewhere. Although the minimum age you could join the Army was 18, boys as young as 15 lied about their age to sign up, and they experienced the horrors of war firsthand. However, young boys were also knowingly recruited to be drummer boys and messengers, and some were employed from the age of 10. Historians estimate that up to 20% of the soldiers who fought during the Civil War were under 18. The lifestyle and liberties of the rich during the Civil War were quite different from those of the poor. Even during the draft, where men were forcibly recruited to the army, the rich in the North could pay a fee of $300 to be exempt or otherwise pay someone else to take their place. In the South, those owning more than 20 slaves were not required to join the fight themselves. In the North, it was usually the immigrant population that inhabited the poorer areas of the cities. They worked in factories, usually in dangerous conditions and for very little pay. There were no laws about work hours, worker safety, or minimum wages, and many factory owners took advantage of this to increase their profits. Most farmers in the Northern Territories were considered poor, and many did not even own a horse as they were too expensive. Despite this, they were largely self-sufficient and did not rely on the income from their crops. During this time, there was a definite shift away from this simple lifestyle, and many young people living in rural areas became entranced by the lure of the city. They moved away from their self-sufficient communities to try and make their fortune, adding to the growing urban population. Life in the city was far from ideal, and many municipalities suffered from problems with excess human waste and diseases sweeping through the closely packed communities. However, cities were invaluable during the Civil War. They provided the perfect recruiting grounds, training camps, military supplies, and media support for the Unionists. Historians consider the Civil War to be the first industrial war and a precursor to the style of warfare seen in the First World War. Armies were no longer self-sufficient, and they required a vast network of support which gave rise to media propaganda that garnered support on the home front. Despite many modernizations, life for the soldiers was tough. Days were long, and the men were awakened at dawn to run drills that would help them become a cohesive fighting force, as many on both sides were not trained soldiers. Recruits dealt with harsh weather, inadequate clothing, and extreme hunger. To supplement the meager army rations, the men would hunt game and forage for fruits, berries, and nuts in the surrounding area. Many soldiers in the Confederate Army were half-starved by the end of the war. Alongside battle fatalities, soldiers were at risk from the primitive medical practices at the time. The idea of infection was not fully understood, and doctors didn't even wash their hands when dealing with sick patients. Even a small wound could result in death, and around two-thirds of the military deaths during the Civil War resulted from disease rather than fatal injury in battle. Life during the Civil War was highly varied, much as it is across the United States today. This war proved to be a defining moment in the moral stance of the United States, even if that may have not been intended when the war was first declared. After the war, America was one step further along in its ongoing journey towards liberty and justice for all. To learn more about the Civil War, check out our book, The Civil War, a captivating guide to the American Civil War and its impact on the history of the United States of America. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.